Hello, and welcome to 5 Minutes of Torah with the BI Rabbi. I'm your BI Rabbi for the day, Rabbi Adam Stein. I'd like to start us off in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which we're reading this very weekend, by looking at the first verse of the first chapter, the first verse of this Parsha, Parshat Vayikra. So this verse says, Vayikra el Moshe vaydaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed lemor. A lot of verbs here. Let's go through this verse together. Vayikra, and he called to Moshe. Vaydaber, and he spoke. So we have, and he called, and then, and he spoke. And who spoke? Adonai spoke, God. To him, to Moses, from the tent of meeting, saying. So he called, he spoke, and saying. Why do we need all of this? Why so many verbs? So let's ask Rashi. Now, you may have heard of Rashi. You may be asking, who's Rashi, right? Now, I did an image search online for Rashi so I could show you a picture of him. And now that image search gave me this young woman. She is Rashi Khanna, a famous movie actress in India. I don't think she's going to tell us much about this verse in Vayikra. Maybe she could. But I'm thinking of this Rashi, our famous Torah commentator, Talmud commentator, most famous Torah and Talmud commentator, and probably most important, a really good French winemaker. Okay, he lived from these years, 1040 to 1105, yes, in France, as I said. And let's look at what Rashi says about this verse. He says all of that. That's a lot of stuff. But let's look at the beginning at first. So Rashi says, whenever God speaks to Moses, he's welcomed. Moses is welcomed by this calling out. Okay, this word Vayikra, and he says that it's a term of endearment. Okay, lashon chiba in Rashi's words, the language of endearment or belovedness. Now, then he proves it with a verse from the book of Isaiah. Okay. It was the same language, this Vayikra, this root kuf resh aleph, used by the ministering angels, for they too called one to the other. Now, where do you recognize this from? From the Kedusha, the Amidah, that we say twice a day, morning and afternoon. We say it on Musaf, on Shabbat, Shacharit. Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam kashem shemakdishim oto b'shmei marom. So we sanctify your name in the world in the way that the angels sanctified your name up in the heights, as it is said by the hand of your prophet. And they called one to another, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot Melech ha'aretz Kevodo. Is the angels calling one to another. And Rashi says they called out with this bit of endearment to each other, just like God calls with a bit of endearment, the calling out before he gives any sort of communication to Moshe. So a little later, Rashi tells us this. He says, and the voice went to Moses alone, for Israel was unable to hear the sound. So Israel, the people of Israel can't hear really God's voice. It's too much for them. He only talks to Moses. But everything God said to Moses for 38 years, it wasn't for his own sake, it was for Israel's sake. Only after the generation of the spies, the people who were too afraid to conquer the land of Israel, the people who listened to the 10 bad spies, the pessimistic spies, instead of listening to the 10 optimistic spies, only after they died, then finally God spoke to Moses for his sake. And of course, he's going to prove it with a verse. After all the people from the I'll show you this in Hebrew as well. After all the people from the generation of the war had passed, people who were living in the wilderness for those 38 years and didn't believe the good spies, who said, we can conquer the land. Finally, God spoke to me, Moses. Finally, he speaks for Moses' sake. Now, that's nice that God was speaking to Moses for Israel's sake for 38 years and finally spoke to Moses for his own sake towards the very end of the 40 years wandering in the desert, in the wilderness. But what does that mean for us in our study of this week's Parsha? Well, here's another thing about this week's Torah portion's first verse, that verse we were looking at. that first word, Vayikra, and God called out, is written in a Torah scroll. Here's that word. But in a Torah scroll, it's written in a very unique way. It doesn't look like this. Rather, it looks like this. Okay, that first word, I'll highlight it for you. It has a little aleph. Let's make it big. A little aleph. And for centuries, if not a couple millennia, the question has been, why is that aleph small? Well, one of the interpretations of this small aleph is that it indicates the humility of Moses. He made this aleph of ani, anochi, of I, small. He didn't want to build himself up. He didn't want to say, look at me, God speaks to me because I'm important. He said, no, God speaks to me, but I'm small. I'm just a human. He's really speaking for Israel's sake, for all of you. Only towards the end does God finally speak to me for my own sake. So I'm thinking, what could this teach us about leaders, about leadership, the value of holding back as a leader and being humble, about mentors and mentorship? If we see God as a mentor to Moses, we can appreciate the way God prefaced every communication to him with this calling out, but a calling out in a way of endearment, as our tradition sees it. And finally, we can learn that the language of the Bible, even when it seems to be so repetitive and redundant, like this, can always come to teach us something. Now, I'll say one more thing about Moses' humility. In the Haggadah for Pesach, which is coming up if you can believe it, Moses is only mentioned once by name in the whole Haggadah, and that's just an offhanded mention in a midrash. But who but a humble leader could lead the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness for 40 years, only to barely show up in the book that guides us through the telling of that very story? Let us hope that we can all be as humble as our teacher Moses. And speaking of the Haggadah and the Seder, we have a wonderful second night family Pesach Seder coming up on Saturday night, the 31st of March. It's at 5 p.m. And then our adult-oriented community Seder at 8 p.m., starting with some cocktails, Pesach cocktails at 7:30 that same night. Shabbat Shalom.